The topic of this lesson is the Tatar-Mongol invasion, which started in the 13th century and became one of the major turning points in Russian history. Now, before we discuss it directly, take a look at these two maps showing the Russian principalities during different periods. And the question that I ask my students is simple. Which political structure would be stronger against the common enemy? And of course, the answer is the one with fewer principalities. And I explain it with an example of a group project. Imagine trying to complete the group project. The fewer people are involved, the easier it is to communicate and make decisions, because a larger group with many competing interests and different work ethic, it's just much harder to organize effectively. I think anyone who ever took part in a group project can attest to that. So what was happening in Russia over time is that the principalities became increasingly fragmented. When a prince died, his territory was divided among his sons, which meant that the political map became more and more divided. And eventually, this fragmentation made Rus vulnerable to the Tatar-Mongol invasion that, as I said, started in the 13th century and spanned over almost 3 centuries and really, really changed the trajectory of Russian history. So before the invasion, the Russian principalities did fight in wars, but it was mostly against each other or protecting their territories against less organized nomadic groups. And also within those military conflicts, there were accepted rules and traditions of warfare. But the Mongol invasions were quite different. The Mongol forces were connected to Genghis Khan, who was known in history for his brutality, and so were his armies. So entire cities were burned, populations were massacred, territories were devastated. And the principalities of Rus were completely unprepared for this type of warfare and could not effectively resist it. So when Rus fell to the Tatar-Mongol invasion, the Tatar-Mongol yoke started. Now, for geographical reasons, the southern regions suffered the most destruction, including Kiev itself. As a result, Kiev declined in importance while the northern regions gradually became stronger. And this shift would eventually contribute to the rise of Moscow as the new political center. So we can say that the Mongol period had both negative, mostly negative, but in some ways also positive consequences for Russian history. And one of the most important negative consequences was political. So during these centuries, Russian princes and ordinary people became accustomed to the idea of a ruler with enormous, nearly unlimited authority. So since the invaders wanted to have political control, Russian princes could no longer independently decide who would become the grand prince. Instead, they had to travel to the Mongol Khans, offer tribute, demonstrate loyalty, and sometimes, actually, not sometimes, often go through a series of degrading challenges that can be kind of compared to the concept of hazing. But they had to go through all of it to receive approval for the rule back home. So the princes who showed the greatest obedience and loyalty to the Khan were the ones rewarded with greater power back in Old Rus. And this had a major effect on the Russian political mindset because over time, the idea of this strong, centralized authority became normalized. And Russians gradually became more accustomed to autocracy and the concept of a powerful ruler above the law. So somebody who can do whatever he wants. Now, before the Mongol invasion, political life in many areas of Rus was actually more participatory, which was the path to a more democratic, would have been the path to a more democratic system. Now, princes were often selected with the involvement of local elites and councils of elders. Bloodline was important, but decision-making involved discussion and negotiation to a much greater degree than it would later. Now, I said there are positive things too. I know I'm kind of focusing more on negative things, but at the same time, the Mongol period also pushed the Russian principalities toward greater unity. And that was the point in time when Russia really started getting its statehood. Now, eventually, many leaders realized, and by leaders, I mean the princes of this time, realized that they could only resist the Mongol domination by uniting and becoming stronger together. And as I mentioned before, this was also the period when Moscow began rising in importance, partly because the northern territories were less devastated than the southern regions. So by the 15th century, we arrive at the rule of Ivan III, who is often credited with ending Mongol domination. But it wasn't one person, it wasn't one battle. In reality, that was a gradual process involving many battles and many leaders and many princes, and at the same time, the weakening of the Mongol power over time, which had nothing to do with the Russian princes. But here I could mention Alexander Nevsky, but I won't, because in this overview, I'm only going over the things, as I said before, that are important for my future lectures. So, Ivan III. He became the ruler associated with the final stage of liberation from the Tatar-Mongol yoke and the strengthening of the Russian state. So he basically united territories under Moscow after Mongols were basically defeated in our history, and he proclaimed himself the first Tsar. Now, the first Tsar of Russia will be Ivan IV, or Ivan the Terrible. But Ivan III was the first Russian ruler to use the word Tsar. Now, he was ruling over Moscow, the land of Moscow, and again, Moscow is becoming the primary political center of the Old Rus. And he chose that name, Tsar, because it comes from the word Caesar, again, showing this connection to the Byzantine imperial traditions that I mentioned in my previous video, and also to the idea of a ruler standing above others. So, to summarize, what were some of the major long-term consequences of the Mongol invasion? So for nearly 3 centuries, Russian rulers and society observed the power of brute force and its effectiveness, and they got used to the idea of this centralized authority. So political traditions became less participatory compared to how it used to be, and overall they became more authoritarian. And perhaps most importantly, the idea of unrestricted power without accountability gradually became normalized within Russian political culture and national mindset, and we will see this mindset throughout the centuries. Okay, now let's return once again to the question that I keep asking throughout my lectures. What about common people? Was life becoming better or worse after this period? And just like my students, at first you might think, well, of course, it became better. The Mongol period was over. And there is some truth to that, but in many ways, life actually became more restrictive, meaning worse for common people. Now, remember the major idea we have been discussing throughout the course: unification under one centralized authority. We saw it before, but here is the period when it really is concentrated in the society. So during the Mongol period, Russian princes observed how effective this absolute centralized power could be. And once Moscow begins rising to power, the rulers want that same kind of a control for themselves. They want absolute authority. And that idea, strong centralized power, becomes one of the defining themes of Russian history for centuries. But if you want absolute power, you also need absolute control over the population. You need to know where people live, how many people live there, how much tax they can pay, and how many men can be drafted into army whenever needed. And because of that, the state begins tightening control over peasants. Now, their personal freedoms become increasingly limited. And common people, during this period of time, gradually lose the ability to move freely from one landowner, from like one land estate to another, to the point where they can only officially do it once per year during a very limited time in the fall. So, while the Russian lands were becoming politically stronger and more unified, common people were often becoming less personally free because the system of statehood was becoming increasingly restrictive, because its main idea and main goal was to maintain the authority of the rulers. So basically, Mongol invasion was that turning point when we begin to see clear limitations imposed on ordinary people, and this trend toward kind of like reduced personal freedom will continue in later periods of Russian history. Okay, we will stop here, and in the next lesson, we will be talking about one of the most famous, or actually infamous, rulers in Russian history, Ivan IV, better known in English as Ivan the Terrible.